reform continues Monday with Congress back in session for the first time since the Senate Finance Committee approved its version of the tax bill. With the focus now on gaining support from the full Senate, joining me is Jimmy Pethokoukis, economic policy analyst at the American Enterprise Institute and a CNBC contributor, along with Mattie Duppler, who is senior fellow at the National Taxpayers Union. Great to have both of you back with us. So, Jimmy, when they go to pick up work on Monday, are they going to be able to get off to a running start here?
I should have every intention to get off to a running start. There still remain a bunch of big questions, and since the one we talk a lot about is that 20% corporate rate, that's the one I would really focus on to see if that number actually sticks at 20%. And so will they end up having to raise that a little bit to get more money, or will they have to phase that thing in over a number of years to raise more money? So I think there's going to be a lot of debate on whether that number holds at 20% as an immediate tax cut.
Meanwhile, Mattie, there's been a lot of focus on senators' different comments over the last couple of days, whether it's Lisa Murkowski, Jeff Flake, of course. I mean, what do you think the vote looks like in the Senate as we stand here?
Yeah, Jimmy P's talking a lot about the math and how we make sure the numbers match up on tax reform, but the political math is just as important. Now, I would say that if you look at the budget vote that happened earlier in the month that really set the stage for tax reform, you had nearly every senator on board for that budget vote. We only lost Rand Paul on that. So that does indicate that there is consensus moving forward. But as you mentioned, there are a number of outstanding issues, one of those being deficit concerns from deficit hawks, another concern being what we do with the pass-through rate for those S-corp businesses. But frankly, between the House and the Senate, there's still a lot of agreement on the principles for tax reform, and that's making sure the American jobs or American businesses are competitive and delivering tax relief for the middle class. Both of those bills do that.
Mattie, is one of the other political considerations here is that the bill does not necessarily poll very well. So are you going to have some legislators say, look, you know, just exactly what hill are we dying on here for a 20% corporate rate? What do we have to do to achieve that? And what does it mean for the scale of an ultimate agreement, do you think?
Well, it depends on how you're asking the question, right? There is considerable consensus that something needs to be done to reform the tax code. Now, once you dig into the details on the House and Senate GOP plans, support does begin to rise. Now, there is still a discussion. Some of us here in Washington who are kind of the bean counters who've been watching tax reform for a while get really excited about it, whereas Americans who are just worried about running their businesses and feeding their families maybe don't pay as much attention to tax reform and don't get as excited about the idea of passing a comprehensive overhaul. But I think there's a lot of things in this bill that will get folks engaged and we'll see a lot of support swell for that. In particular, getting the individual tax rates down. JCT says that you're going to deliver tax relief for pretty much 90% of Americans. That's considerable, and it's hard to see Americans not supporting a tax plan that does just that.
Listen, if the fate of this tax plan is going to depend on this thing being polling well or being wildly popular, then there's not going to be a tax plan. I think Republicans are, I mean, listen, they would love better poll numbers. I don't think that's really going to happen. For no other reason that, one, people don't see why we need a big corporate tax cut, and two, they don't quite understand yet how this pays off for them. Will their taxes go up? Will they go? There's still a lot of confusion. But Republicans are going to press forward on this no matter what the polls say. And I still think it's more likely than not, if not a bit more likely than not.
We're showing Jimmy the comparison between the House and Senate bills, and there's a lot of focus on the state and local tax, what will happen there, on the mortgage interest rate deduction, even on the number of tax brackets. Is this bill just going to end up looking most like the Senate's, or whatever they can come to terms on? The House just goes along with that?
I think it ends up looking most like the Senate because they have a very, very slim margin for error. So I think it's almost by definition going to look more like the Senate bill, which means it's probably going to be more focused on deficit reduction than what the House bill was. So that's what I would look for. I would look for how they reduce the revenue loss. And if they end up losing votes in the Senate, it's going to be because it just loses too much money.
Mattie, last word to you on the numbers there. You have Democrats now saying, oh, we're focused on the deficit and we want to make sure this thing doesn't blow it up. Does that mean that we're probably not going to see any Democratic votes ultimately for this thing to pass?
I think that it's interesting. Democrats are now finding God on the deficit after 8 years of deficit spending plans. But I think that moving forward, you'll see support continue to rise because there's one big reason that we're talking about tax reform in a serious way, and that's because Donald Trump is president, and the people who elected Donald Trump president feel left behind by this economy. So the way to get it moving again, and we've seen a lot of research on this fact, is that cut in the corporate income tax rate. And Jimmy P is right. It's hard to articulate why that's so important for the average worker. But frankly, you look at got the research on this, and that will funnel down to more productivity, higher wages, and a bigger paycheck for all Americans.
All right, we got to go. But Mattie D and Jimmy P, thank you guys, as always.
Thanks,
guys. Appreciate getting your points of view here, and we'll kick this thing back off starting Monday. $1,000, that's how much some LOL surprise stores